after class and take it home and study it. Next Sunday, we'll take a look at that. Be turning your Bible to Judges chapter 3. Today we're talking about Ehud. We're talking about Ehud today. So we'll be in Judges chapter 3. We'll be looking at verses 12 through verse 30. 12 through 30. Real quick, let me give you an update on the week. We had a very, very busy week in Cookeville this week. I told you I had a meeting, and there was a little confusion about when that meeting was supposed to be, but it started last Sunday, and 111 is a pretty good road, but still going up early in the afternoon, coming back really late at night. That's a very tiring thing, but it was a good meeting. And I've seen it only really ever once before. On the Monday night of the meeting, we talked about conversion and what conversion means in the life of the Christian. And when we stood up to sing the invitation song, there was total silence because the song leader didn't start the song. And he came up front and he said, "I can't lead this song the way my life is right now." And he just stopped the service. And he made a confession of wrong, and we had a prayer for him, and then the song service resumed. But I thought that's incredible that he did that because he knew that he couldn't lead that song in the condition that he was in. I admired his courage for doing that. I thought that was a brilliant display of things. One of the things we found out Sunday was there were several non-Christians who were visiting the assembly. One was his wife had been converted a few months ago, I think, and he had been visiting sporadically with her. And he came on Monday night of the meeting when we were talking about conversion. And she said, after the service, she goes, "He's really thinking after what you said." And then Tuesday night we had the meeting, and we were talking about judgment and the end of the world and how to be prepared and things of that sort. And when we stood up for the invitation song, you may have seen people do this before. He gripped the bench like this in front of him, and he was just shaking, and tears were just streaming down his eyes. And of course, I was just bawling because I was like, please, please, please let him do what he needs to do. And he came forward that night, and he was baptized. And no sooner had he been baptized than a young lady came up, and she goes, I've not been baptized the right way. And she was baptized too. So we had two baptisms on Tuesday night. And so that was just encouraging. It's great to be a part of that. Text the elders right after. I said, "Boy, it's been a great meeting. This good things going on." So it's just great to see that. And they were pumped up. And how could you not be after seeing something like that? But I would say it was a great meeting. We had a great meeting because of that. But it's good to be back. There's no place like home. And someone says it feels like you've been gone a year. It does. Sometimes a week feels like a year when you've been gone like that. But sure glad to be back. And a lot happened while we were gone. It was I think it was Sunday night or Monday night. I think Joel or somebody posted a picture of Sue, and it looked like somebody had taken a baseball bat and beat Sue Swafford where she had fallen and bruised, and I hated to hear that and hated about Brenda's mom. Kay was such a wonderful person, and sure hated that happened, but glad for her for the reunion she's having. But nevertheless, it does pain us greatly when loved ones pass from this life. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. She saves money on costume decorations. It does, so that's good. And I appreciate so much your encouragement. Art called on Monday. He goes, "Well, we're going to try to be up there." And I thought, you do not need to be coming to a meeting, up in Cookeville. And they'd already done a lot anyway with other things. But I appreciate those that checked in, and just means a lot. All right, let's get into Judges chapter 3 today. Ehud. Did you read ahead? Look at the story a little bit. Sometimes people say the Bible is a boring book. Did you find anything boring about the story of Ehud? It's not just not boring. It's just downright graphic. I mean, you talk about some of the things that happened in ancient history. They try to parallel those in Hollywood, and Hollywood gets the credit for some of the gore and the drama. But those things like this, they were part of history. And they're part of Bible history, and they did happen during the time of the Judges. All right, because there's so many verses, and this is going to happen with a few of our judges, especially like Gideon and a few, that we're not going to be able to just read the text. So we'll read it as we go through. We'll look at it as we go through. But let's start with our number one question. Number one question. This covers verses 12 through 15. Here's the question. What are the conditions for Israel? And then the follow-up question would be, how is this possible? Didn't the people learn their lesson the first time? Also, in this text, what happened as a result? And is there a lesson for us in what we're about to describe? Do you think that we tend to struggle with the same sins over and over again? And then the follow-up to that is, why is that? If we do seem to struggle with sometimes the same sin, why is that? So what are the conditions like? When you read this chapter, how does the Bible describe the condition of Israel at this time? And so the question is, how is that even possible? I mean, didn't they learn their lesson the first time? What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, sorry, Don, go ahead. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. They seem to forget. Yeah, so that happens within a generation. Somebody else's, Philip, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, they've been rebellious for a long time, and now they're in a foreign land, and so things have changed a lot. Somebody here was saying something. If you want to pick up, I don't know who's saying that. Yeah. Yeah, and that's true. And Don was talking about generationally. Sometimes we read the Judges, you think the stories happened. There's at the end of one judge, and then that following year they did that. But has there been some time passed between these two judges? If you go back up in chapter 3 and you look at verse 11, I know that Othniel is on the scene of history, but when Othniel leaves, between Othniel and Ehud, how much time lapses between the two of these? Well, in verse 11, it says the land had rest for 40 years. I mean, so you're talking about, to Don's point, you're talking about an entire generation of people that come up. It's very easy to forget things like that. So let's take a look at the description, verse 12. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. Then he gathered to himself the people of Ammon and Amalek, went and defeated Israel and took possession of the city of palms. So the children of Israel served Eglon, king of Moab, 18 years. So, between the last peace they had and this, there's been a real lapse of time. The Bible describes them as doing evil, which means they did wickedly. Literally, the word means unethically. You get a sense of just morally, they were just really corrupt people. In fact, in some descriptions, it says literally worse than. The idea would be that whatever they did was actually a degree worse than the generation before them because they did it again. And I think this language is interesting. We're gonna see this a lot in the Judges. It says, we see it a lot in the Bible. It said they did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, the people around them may have agreed with their lifestyle choices, but everything they did was open to the view of God, and God saw what they were doing, and he was not pleased with that. And so they sort of reverted back to behavior of previous generations. Again, there's been a lapse of time, the last passing of 40 years in Judges chapter 3 and verse 11. And if you'll hold your place here and go with me to the book of 1 Samuel, there's actually a commentary from Samuel later on this particular event. 1 Samuel chapter 12. Go with me to 1 Samuel chapter 12. And Don even mentioned this specific language, 1 Samuel chapter 12. Look at verse 9. So you have sort of this survey of some of the history of Israel in verse 9 of chapter 12 of 1 Samuel. And he says, and when they forgot the Lord their God, he sold them into the hand of Sisera, commander of the army of Hazor, into the hand of the Philistines, into the hand of the king of Moab. That could be a reference to Eglon there, and they fought against them. He's talking about in the times of the judges, but notice in verse 9, before all of these events, he says, they just forgot God. And we've talked about how generations can sometimes forget God. So the question again is, well, how is that possible? Why didn't they learn their lesson the first time? And you've already stated the truth is that we so quickly forget history sometimes. We forget to learn from it. History should be a teacher. In fact, tonight, one of the questions talks about erasing history. And the more I got to study on it, the more we just sort of directed it to an entire lesson. So tonight we'll be talking about the value of history and a Christian's view of history. Whether things in the past are bad or whether things in the past are good, history has some importance to us. And so we're going to talk about that tonight as an actual lesson. But sometimes we fail to use it the right way. And what's the old expression? That those who don't learn from history are bound to repeat it. We're just bound to repeat it. And this seems to be, you see it in Judges, there's just this cycle. And sometimes even in our lives, there's this cycle. And so there's a consequence to their choosing to do evil again, just like they had done before. Yes, sorry, Bobby.
We see it today, too.
Yeah.
People want to deny history. There's people that want to deny the Holocaust.
Yeah.
All forms of...
Yeah, we just, depending on who you're talking to, we just pick and choose what part of history you choose to ignore. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight. Even if something is really bad, can you erase it? I mean, and there's a value to that. We're going to talk tonight. We're actually going to see scripturally that there's a value. Even if they're bad things, there's a value to those things that we can actually use today. Tom? Right. Yep. Is that the Art Greer theory or the Tom Greer theory? It's a Greer family theory. It does seem to do that. In fact, there's plenty of warnings in the Bible about that. Prosperity is not in and of itself right or wrong. I mean, it's just sort of a neutral thing, but it tends to follow that. Maybe that is 1 Timothy 6:10, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So an attitude toward that, and it tends to be corruptive. It tends to be pervasive. I think people struggle with that. I think you're right. I think through history we can kind of see that. That's a good point. All right, so what's the consequence here? They do evil, and what's the consequence? They're put in subjugation to who? Eglon of... Do you know anything about the Moabites? Have they been friends of God's people for a long, long time? In fact, in classification, they're right near the top of some of the number one enemies of God's people. They have always been that way. And so they're the enemies of God's people. And in verse 13, it says they went and took the city of palms. Do you know what city that is? Now, how sad is that? Because when they went into the land of Canaan, what's the very first city in a mighty way that they took? Remember that? March around the city once for 6 days, 7 times on the seventh day, they'll blow the horns, and the city just fell to the ground. Now, probably at this point, it had not been completely rebuilt to its former glory, probably hadn't been. But you're still talking about historically from a faith standpoint. I mean, Hebrews 11:30, isn't it? By faith the walls of Jericho fell. So there's this glorious, triumphant marker of God's deliverance, and it was retaken. It's just sad. And you can read about, in Joshua chapter 6, you can read about the taking of the city of Jericho. So Judges bears out right now 2 times in the history of these people. This is the second judge we're seeing. Judges bears out that they were continually guilty of the same sins. They're committing idolatry. They did that before. They're committing fornication as a part of idolatry. They did that before. So the question now comes up, does it seem like, because there's a pattern here, at least with these people, does it seem like we tend to I think nationally, I think that's kind of been brought out already. But even personally, do we seem like maybe sometimes we struggle with the same sins? And if that's the case, why is that? Why do you think that? Or not? I would love to hear what you think about that. Joel? Right? So why is that? And I agree with Joel. I think there are certain temptations that seem to affect us more. There's only three avenues. There's lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Some people really struggle with pride of life, and others people really struggle with lust of the flesh, and some people really struggle with lust of the eyes, and in whatever way that works out. So why is that? Why isn't like if Joel's tempted with lust of the eyes, why am I not tempted with lust of the eyes? Or if I'm tempted with lust of the flesh, why is he not tempted with lust of the flesh? Why is it that there seems to be certain sins that we really struggle against personally? Any theories or opinions on that? Tom? And then Bobby? Go ahead, Tom. Yeah, nothing new under the sun, Bobby? Okay, personal strength. You were going to say pretty much the same thing? Yeah, do you think some of it's based on personality? Right, we're all different. And so because we're all different, the way that temptation comes at us is very different. Do you remember the words of James 1? Remember we studied James a while back. And he says, every man is tempted when he is drawn away, and he uses a unique word to describe it. Remember? His own lust. All right, so what affects me might be really different based on personality, and that could be based on a number of things. Influences when you're young, associates, peers, just you list it, and there could be any number of things that cause us to be tempted with that. And so in this room, right, there may be people in this room who they don't ever tell a lie. They're just not tempted by that. But do you think other people are tempted to lie? And they really, really struggle with that? And there may be people in this room and in the world, for that matter, who are never, ever, ever tempted to get on a computer or whatever way they would access that and look at pornography. It just has zero interest to them at all. Some people are really tempted by that. Some people are never tempted to drink alcohol, and some people are really tempted by that. And it's just for any number of reasons they seem to do that. And then remember Hebrews chapter 12, the writer says, there is a sin that so easily besets us. And I think we all struggle with those sins that easily beset us. Tommy?
Well, it's the same in a non-spiritual or sinful way, because that's like you take two men.
Yeah.
One man may love to ride motorcycles.
Yeah, that's exactly
The
right.
other guy has no interest whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it's what satisfies our mind, and it's what is attractive to our mind for whatever reason. I think it's just a part of nature
It is.
to have those psychological attractions.
Yeah, however that works out. Some people like winning teams like Tennessee, and some people like losing teams like Alabama. It's just that's the way it works out. I just had to throw that out there. And you know me, I'm sort of indifferent when it comes to football. Just had to say it though. Gene? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So and to Gene's point, if we're studying the judges, when you get to a judge like Samson, did he have a weakness? Women. He's just a mess before women. If they were beautiful and they just had power over him, he really struggled with that. There are people in this world that just have no. They don't have that same problem, but there are some people that do. And so I think a lot of it's just based on our personalities and our uniqueness, and we all have those areas where we are weakest. And when we give into it, we seem like we really struggle with that. But I think that's something to be noted from these first couple of verses. All right, so let's move on to number two. Number two. It may seem insignificant, number two, but what is the greater lesson behind Ehud's building of the dagger? How important is planning to any mission in life? So when he builds this unique weapon, and we're going to talk about this weapon that he builds, what's the significance of that? Is it just, he said, you know what, I just feel like today this would be a great day to build this kind of weapon, or did he have a plan in mind? Gene? Yes? Right? All right, so he knew what he was going to do with the weapon when he built the weapon. Let's consider some of the characteristics of it. Look at verse 15. When the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. By him the children of Israel sent tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Verse 16, now Ehud made himself a dagger, and then we have parenthetically a description of it. It was double-edged and a cubit in length, and fastened it under his clothes on his right thigh. Now all of this says something about what we get a little bit of insight into the thinking of Ehud as he does this, okay? So first of all, it's double-edged. And Gene has already told us there's a specific design for a weapon like this. It's meant for thrusting. It's not really meant for hacking because you lose some of the weight of the blade when you only have a single edge to it. But it's meant for thrusting. And generally speaking, when you have a double-edged, even in the Bible, what's the quality of a double-edged? It's super. It's like razor sharp. Hebrews 4:12. The Word of God is like a double-edged sword, and it's so sharp it can cut down to the thoughts and intents of a person. So we have a description of that. It's razor sharp, and you've got the sharpness of it on both sides of that. I saw a hand or two, Philip. Right. Yeah. And a lot of the Benjamites seem like they were left-handed people, so that's going to play a factor here. The second thing is the length of it. Sorry, Gene, go ahead. Okay, so let's talk about that. It was a cubit in length. What does that mean? Very short. Okay. Anybody take a guesstimate on a cubit? I know there's a lot of debate on that. And Tom's, generally speaking, that's what it is. Tom went just like this. It's usually the length of between the joint where the elbow is at and the tip of the finger or the top of the fist. 12 to 18 inches, something like that. What it means is he wasn't carrying a full broadsword, right? He didn't have a huge sword on him. He had something that was very short. And what was the purpose of that? It's concealable, right? This is his concealed carry weapon that he has with him right there. And so we even get a sense of that because in verse 16 it says, he fastened it under his clothes. Now put yourself in that day. He would have had, they wore probably tighter fitting undergarments, but the clothes here, what would that be a reference to? All right, they wore robes back then, very loose-fitting, flowing robes, and he concealed it where? On his right side. Why would he do that? He's a left-handed man, and he's got something in mind. If you're patting somebody down and you know they're a left-handed person, you're probably not going to check the right side because it was customary to wear it on the other side. Mm-hmm. Right. Benjamin, yeah. And they seem to have quite a few from them, just a genetic trait or something like that, but they seem to have quite a few among that number. So he has something extremely sharp, something extremely concealable, and he puts it on the side where it would likely not have been noticed. So by concealing the dagger on the side, not typical of a left-hander, and like Gene said, where customarily it would not have been, he had the best chance at concealment. He's thinking ahead on how this plan can come to fruition. Obviously, he's thinking through as he's making this. He's thought through who he's going to use it on, right? Because he knows the target. He knows something about the target. This is going to be used on Eglon, and we're about to have the description. He's a very fat man. That's what the Bible says. He knows how he's going to use it. He knows how he's going to conceal it. All these things were thought through. So this is a well thought out plan. Is there a lesson here for us? I understand that we are not infallible, but does God expect us to kind of think ahead and think about the consequences of the things that we do? In the Bible, that's called wisdom, right? Now, we're not infallible. It doesn't mean that even the best laid plans sometimes from our perspective fall through. But wisdom is not, on our end, wisdom is not this infallible knowledge, but it is trying to think through, if I do this, then the consequence for that will be this. And that's what wisdom is. The more seasoned, the more experience we get, we do that. But I think James 1:5 and following, we studied that in James, is a great example of that. If you lack wisdom, here's what you do. And then he puts that in the context of trials. And so the way we think through consequences really matters. Colossians 4 is a great example of that. And I'm trying to hurry because we're going to run out of time. Colossians 4 is a great example where he says, redeem the time and use grace in your speech toward those on the outside. So you think about how we're going to do that. So Ehud uses a little bit of wisdom here. And of course, he's working as an agent of God's justice on this occasion. He's bringing justice to Eglon that God wanted meted out. All right, so number 3. And I told you we're going to abbreviate some of the end comments. We're going to save that for tonight's lesson. But here's number 3. In our world of cancel culture and political correctness, God's description of Eglon would be found offensive. Because look at verse 17. So he brought the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now, Eglon was a very fat man. And somebody would say, God is just fat shaming. That's what he's doing. He's fat. Cancel God because he's fat shaming Eglon right here. Okay? Why do people think that? And what does this description tell us about facts and how we respond to facts? Now, that last part that we had in our question, which is, there's a good lesson about history. Should history be preserved or erased? Whether or not actions in someone or some nation's history are good. Is history valuable for us today? We're going to save that because I've got more extended thoughts on that for tonight. But what about the first part of that? There are a lot of people in our culture who would say, you can't talk like that about people. Is God trying to just arbitrarily insult Eglon? What's he doing? He's just describing him. He's a very, very fat man. Now, there's a reason why that's in the text. Drop down to verse 22. We'll see this in just a second. When and to Gene's point, he's thrusting this. When he puts it in, he intended for this to happen. It had to be long enough to reach internal organs, right? It had to get to where it needed to get. Had to be sharp enough to cut through all the fat. And he puts it in, verse 22, even the hilt went after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the dagger out of his belly. His entrails came out. Was the weapon that he designed specific to that purpose? Is the description that God provides of his size, is it important to know because of what happens later? So he's simply providing a detail. Historically, this is what happened. Historically, this is what the man looked like. He was a very fat man. The word combination here, very fat, literally means ridiculously fat. So that's the Bible's description of this man. It is not offered as an insult. It's just simply, again, a statement of a fact that sets up the word picture of his death in verse 22, which would be difficult to understand if we didn't have the first description of the fact that he was a ridiculously fat man. Because if you take an average-sized fellow, you take a slim fellow like Zach, and you say he got stabbed and the fat closed over the hilt of the blade, you'd be like, well, that doesn't make sense because he's a really trim guy. He's just a really in-shape fellow. But it makes sense with Eglon, right? It makes sense with Eglon because of that description. Yet today in our culture, we are threatened with the loss of our ability to explain details because motive is impugned for every detail that we provide. For example, you couldn't say today about somebody, you couldn't say he was a very fat person because it's considered fat shaming. It's considered insulting that you would describe a person that way. Somebody would say, you're a racist for doing that. You just said somebody's fat, you're a racist, or that's discrimination. But here's the question. Is it possible to use descriptive language with the best intentions and not mean it as an insult? Is it possible to do that? Now, should we be tactful in our language? Sure. Be tactful in our language, and we shouldn't try to be insulting, but it is what it is, right? So if somebody robs a bank, and you're an eyewitness to that, you see somebody run out, and they say, "What did he look like?" And you say, "Well, I really can't say. I'll probably offend him." Was he tall? I can't say he's tall because I'll probably tall shame somebody. Is he short? I don't know. Probably short shaming somebody. Was he skinny? I don't know. I don't want to make fun of skinny people. Well, was he fat? You can't dare say anything about fat people. And we've come to a really weird stage where you can't use descriptive language of what is just simply historically the case. You can't. Yes, sir. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Joel, you had your hand up? Yes. Right. 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 Yeah, there was. Yeah, recently there was a pop artist. I mean, she's got to be within the 300 to 400 pound range, and somebody used the word fat to describe her. I mean, she's fat, and somebody said no, and she took great offense to that. She goes, "You can't say that. I'm just very curvy, you know." Yes, but you're also large, you know. So we've come a long way in being able to use language like God uses to describe people.
But it's also part of the process of not allowing us to describe other things accurately.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of disguising many things
Yes.
that are not right.
Yeah. Right, because it's not just simply about weight. It's homosexual or other choices that people.
Look at the spin that's put on everything coming out of Washington, D.C. on all sides.
Yeah.
We spin things. We don't
Yeah.
say the truth. We spin it.
Right. Yes. Yes, Cindy. Yeah, that's right. You can't say male, female. You can't say gay. You can't use terminology to describe things anymore. Gene. Yeah. Oh yeah. Can't even say that now. But God does that. Now, is God's motive pure? Of course it is. So our motive needs to be pure. We use a little grace to season our speech, but we cannot accept the premise that using accurate terms to describe a situation or people within a situation means that you have impure motive or evil thoughts. That's not what that means. And so God gives us a good example of that. Now, the last question is, because the rest of it is just the story, what happens? All right, so we're going to read that real quick. What happens? And why is that so important, especially to the people? Because when he does what he does, he changes the mindset of the people. His action actually fuels the courage of the crowd. So here we go real quick. We'll just kind of hopefully describe it as we go through in the last few minutes. All right. So verse 18, he had finished presenting the tribute. That's taxation. They're taxing the people. He's bringing the tax to the people. He sent away the people who carried the tribute. So they're done. The crowd of folks that walk in, Eglon sends them away. And then Ehud steps in. So he turns back from the stone images that were Gilgal. It means they were sent away. They made it as far as Gilgal, away from this place, and then he has a plan to go back. And so he says, "I have a secret message for you, O king." He said, "Keep silence." All who attended him went out from him. And he did have a message. It was a message of justice from God. But he does that. Why does he want everybody out of the courtroom or the parlor that he's in? He's got something to do, and he needs the privacy to do that. So Ehud came to him. Now, as he was sitting upstairs in his cool private chamber, those houses back then, they had favored rooms that probably were rooms that caught the breezes, and they were favorite because in the summertime heat, they were the favorite rooms of people back then. And so he's in the cool private chamber. Ehud said, "I have a message from God for you." That's the message of justice from him. So he arose from his seat. He reached with his left hand and took the dagger from his right thigh, and he thrust it into his belly. There's that thrusting motion. We just read verse 22, the hilt went in after the blade and the fat closed. I mean, the whole entire knife, all of it is inside of Eglon, for he did not draw the dagger out. He couldn't. I mean, the fat covered it up. He just couldn't get to it, and his entrails came out. So Ehud went out through a porch and shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked him. So they're in this room, and he escapes out of another way. And when he had gone out, Eglon's servants came to look. To their surprise, the doors to the upper room were locked. They couldn't get in. And so they said he's probably attending to his needs in his cool chamber. What did they think? And you don't have to be very descriptive, but what did they think? He's using the bathroom. He needs privacy. So they just set him in there, left him in there. While they waited till they were embarrassed, I mean, they waited until a long enough time that they thought, okay, something else is going on. He's not even responding. And still had not opened the doors of the upper room. Therefore, they took the key and opened them, and there was their master fallen dead on the floor. He was just dead at that point. Ehud had escaped while they delayed and passed beyond the stone images. You find a reference to those back in verse 19. He kind of meets up with them and goes past that, beyond the stone images, and escaped to Syria. It happened when he arrived that he blew the trumpet. That would be a horn. He had a horn he blew in the mountains of Ephraim, and the children of Israel went down with him from the mountains, and he led them. Verse 28, he said, "Follow me, for the Lord has delivered your enemies from the Moabites into your hands." So they went down. They seized the fords of the Jordan leading to Moab, and did not allow anyone to cross over. And at that time they killed about 10,000 men of Moab, all stout men of valor. So these are mighty men, but not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. Does it sometimes take one person doing a great feat before others will get in line and follow? Yeah, and that's what happens on this occasion. So you have great deliverance, and so Ehud's actions gave courage to the people. Pretty self-explanatory story, but a lot of really good stuff in it. Any questions or comments at the end on Ehud? Yeah, covered his feet. Yeah, exposed the parts that he needed to expose for that. Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, guys, thank you. Shamgar, only one verse. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about Shamgar next week, our third judge. We'll put a peg in it there. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Good to be back.